Okay, well, we're losing some of our viewers. I'll go ahead and just give a brief introduction of myself. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties here. So I'm Mary Kay Magistad. I was a correspondent in China for 15 years and in Southeast Asia for 7 years before that. Jonathan is back. Can you hear us now?
I can hear you now.
We've each given a very brief introduction of ourselves, and
thank you so much. It's like live radio.
Yeah.
All right, fabulous. I will add to those brief.
It's very exciting.
A quick hello from myself. My name is Jonathan Landreth. I used to work at Asia Society editing the ChinaFile website. I spent the better part of 24 years writing about China in one way or another, covering everything from banned spiritual cult leaders to the flow of oil, to China's factories, to the Beijing Olympics, to the increasingly complicated dance between Hollywood and China's movie industry in a push for soft power. I said to Mary Kay, I wouldn't embarrass her in public, but I will say that I've been a fan of her work for a long time. If you haven't yet had the chance to listen to her new 9-part podcast on China's New Silk Road, that's your first homework assignment. It's absolutely a must listen. I had a lovely chat with Alyssa MacDonald, who I'm meeting really just for the second time here today, who is really kind of a gatekeeper for a big team of Bloomberg reporters who speak many languages, who are helping to interpret China for Bloomberg's enormous global platform. Alyssa's based in Sydney. I think she's told you that. So we're gathered. We hope to be joined by a fourth person who we hope will be able to dial in from Beijing, Lloyd Randall, who has the unique position of being able to cover global sports for the Chinese digital platform Star News. His audience is in 40 countries in Africa, and his work covering sports for that audience on a Chinese platform really represents a new frontier in Chinese media and journalism. So without much further ado, I'd like to say what we're going to do is spend the next 20, 25 minutes talking about what we do as journalists, and then open the floor to questions from the audience, which we hope you'll post into the chat. Each of us will put our email and maybe our LinkedIn if you want to follow up with any of us afterwards into the chat as well. So stealing a page out of Mary Kay's book, when she was teaching audio journalism at my alma mater, Berkeley, she told me that she used to ask very fundamental questions of her students, trying to get their impressions of what it is a journalist does. So Mary Kay, what does a journalist do?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for that nice introduction. Actually, when I was teaching at Berkeley, even more in the international reporting classes I taught, I tried to get students to start with a beginner's mind, as they say in Buddhism, which is that basically you don't assume you know before you go in and do the reporting on the ground. You know, you can bring in some hypotheses, you can bring in some questions, but part of the point in us being someplace like China is that you actually get out and talk to people and are perceptive and look around and are open to hearing what an experience looks like and feels like from someone else's perspective and from multiple different perspectives. So, you know, you recognize that something that seems obvious to you is not at all obvious to other people, that there are things that aren't obvious to you that are obvious to other people. All of those get integrated into your reporting and into the stories that you tell and how you frame those stories.
So what are some of the unique challenges that arise when getting out to talk to Chinese people?
So I've reported in, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 countries. And I would say that there are some things that are a little, I wouldn't even say they're unique. I mean, I think that in the 90s, when I was first reporting in China, and probably now again, although I haven't reported as much in the last couple of years in China. I left China in 2013. I've gone back about once a year up until 2 years ago. that people would be a little wary when they were speaking into a microphone because they weren't quite sure what the implications might be for them if the powers that be didn't like what they said. But I had also reported before I came to China in Cambodia and what was still called Burma at the time, and Vietnam, and in other countries that have authoritarian governments. So in some ways, some of the Chinese I talked to, even in the 90s, were more willing to state opinions, and sometimes opinions that were critical, than people in some of the other places I reported. I think in reporting in China, just to be aware that a lot of different things can be going on at the same time. Something and its opposite can be true at the same time. Of course, that's also true in other places, but in China, you just need to be aware that, digging deeper is always worth the effort.
You mentioned subjects being afraid of the powers that be. I remember very clearly some subjects with whom I'd speak, assuming that because I worked for American media, I was working for the American government. And there was a big disconnect between that explanation of an American conception of journalism and what journalism is often conceived of to be in China, which is a medium for the state, in support of the state. Alyssa, let me turn to you. When you're working with bilingual reporters who are trying to report a concept from a place you've not lived, how do you make sure that what they're trying to convey to you is not lost in translation?
Yeah, that's definitely an important and challenging part of my job. I think just to add to Mary Kay's definition of a journalist, we should be conduits for information. And I often feel that working in a collaborative way with bilingual or multilingual journalists, that's part of my job as a kind of conduit for information. In the Bloomberg newsroom, I'd say the main way that we kind of keep on top of the facts is with a lot of collaboration. Like on a daily basis, I have several meetings where perhaps 20 people who are covering the China story from different angles will be in a room together, in a Zoom room like this together, discussing the various aspects of the story. So there'll be reporters who are on the ground, there'll be editors. Sometimes we'll be bringing in information from analysts as well. Like it's Bloomberg, there's always someone watching the data. And in that way, we spend a lot of time kind of bouncing aspects of stories off each other to try to ensure that we are getting as close as we can to what's really happening.
You describe a team effort, and each piece of that team, from journalist to data analyst to editor, really makes the story. I think a lot of people don't understand how collaborative journalism has to be. What are the characteristics that you hope to bring, or you hope to find in a potential recruit if you're hiring new journalists?
Obviously, it depends somewhat on the role that you're looking to fill. I would say that the ideal set of skills for a great reporter, I wouldn't necessarily say that being a fantastic writer is top of the list for that person, but having someone who is just endlessly curious, perhaps not necessarily massively tactful always, like someone who's prepared to keep pushing and keep exploring information. Those would be key skills there. But, there are other sets of skills, particularly in business journalism, which are just absolutely essential to be part of that mix. So you need someone who's a good writer. You need someone who can really understand the data. I'd say that top of the list for hiring for me at the moment is certainly language skills. I think curiosity is sort of innate, and all journalists need that. But I think a lot of other skills, I think writing skills can be taught. I think a lot of data analysis skills can be taught. I think if you're coming to the table with a lot of curiosity and some Chinese language skills, then you'd be a good prospect right now for us.
I know I have limited Chinese. I studied for quite a while. I've never been able to consider myself fluent, and I always had to rely on the collaboration of an assistant. I would hire young Chinese graduates of colleges who had good English and had an interest in the way international journalism worked. And I relied very closely and trusted in them my stories before I was publishing them. I wrote freelance for, over a dozen papers from the Hollywood Reporter to the New York Times about mostly the Chinese media industry. And media in China is a sensitive business. It's right up there with arms dealing by some accounts, because information is power. And some of my assistants didn't like what I was doing, and they would leave. But others were very curious, as you described, and were willing to be politely pushy. Mary Kay, what's your
That's a better way to put it.
With Chinese journalists?
With Chinese journalists I worked with, or other Chinese journalists?
How about both?
Okay. Well, I was really lucky to work with some extremely, bright, insightful young people. And I, too, would hire assistants right out of college and usually work with them for, a couple of years, and they'd go on to grad school or whatever. And, my Chinese as well is, I would say, short of fluent. But I worked hard, and I started learning it when I was in my 30s. I'd already spent 7 years in Southeast Asia reporting, and, did my best, in my free time when I was in China to, pull it up a couple of notches. So my Chinese assistants definitely helped on the language side, particularly when researching written sources. But also, I think, and extremely important to the reporting process, even if I had been completely fluent in Chinese, they brought, I didn't grow up in China. I'm not Chinese. So when I'm reporting on a country, I, can only bring in what I know. And I think that an important thing for a good journalist is to be humble, to know what you don't know, and to listen to people who can provide a perspective to you of, well, you might think this, but this is how it looks here, and this is why this is happening. So that's my experience with the journalists I worked with. With the journalists who Chinese journalists who I got to know to a greater or lesser extent over time, it was interesting watching a sort of an opening up, I would say, in the beginning of this century, when Chinese journalists felt like they had more room to do real journalism there for a few years. And, some would maybe even share some of what they'd been reporting with Western journalists, because maybe they couldn't get it out through the channel they wanted to get it out through, but they could get it out some other way. But also there just seemed to be a real appreciation as there were more journalism schools opening, as there were more and teaching real journalism, and more journalists who were doing work like in Caijing or Caixin, the business magazines in China. That's kind of been clamped down on. Not kind of, it has been clamped down on under Xi Jinping, and so there's not that kind of room anymore. But it was there when I was there, and it was very interesting and heartening to see. And my personal hope is that there comes a time when those people who trained in journalism and as young journalists were able to do really substantive stories about social changes and social issues in China get that opportunity again.
I'm glad to hear you shout out Caijin and Caixin, both of which were publishing partners of ChinaFile at Asia Society. We were making sure that their work reached the Asia Society audience. And I encourage anyone who's watching, if you haven't checked out ChinaFile, go into the archives and look up some of the work from those two really remarkable and now sadly crippled Chinese publications. Alyssa, you and I talked when we met the other day about other means to understand what's going on in China, particularly when you're looking at it from outside. And one of those ways, of course, is by checking social media. We have incredible tools. Google Translate these days can give you a moderately accurate understanding of what's happening, even if you don't read Chinese. And if you have bilingual colleagues around who can help your thinking, you can kind of dip your toe into the giant Chinese internet. So what ways is Bloomberg watching and reporting China from outside China using tools such as Weibo and other platforms?
Yeah, I'd say Weibo is obviously a key one for us. And, looking at work by sort of bloggers like Chairman Rabbit and people like that, I must say that largely for me, maybe looking at these platforms for a bit of inspiration is one thing. I think when it comes to reporting, I am surrounded by colleagues with much better language skills. And so, I'm never going to be relying on myself and Google Translate on social media. I'm always going to be taking ideas and thoughts and stuff that kind of pops up to colleagues with those language skills.
I see in the chat that our colleague Lloyd in Beijing is still trying to get in, so there's hope yet. Sorry for the disappointment. If anyone was hoping most to speak with Lloyd, who's in a unique position at the moment, being inside China. Technical difficulties will be a part of your journalism career. It's a guarantee.
Yes.
Always take 2 tape recorders and have many pens. These are basic fundamental things to ask yourself. Mary Kay, your recent podcast series, Remarkable, does this thing where you go and partner with reporters around the world, looking at the ways in which China is having a greater influence now than ever before. I just got finished listening to the episode of you talking with Panamanians of Chinese descent about the increased influence and investment of China along the Panama Canal, right in America's backyard. Tell me about tell our audience a little bit about the mission of the podcast.
Yeah. Well, so, I spent 15 years reporting in China, but I've also reported in most countries in Asia. I had the 7 years in Southeast Asia before that, but when I was based in China, my editors would often send me out to look. There were specific stories in each country that were, about the domestic issues within that country, but increasingly it was also about China's impact on that country and China's investments in that country. And as China's Belt and Road Initiative has started to gain steam over the course of the last decade. It was announced in 2013, so last 8 years. I just thought, this is something that I think most Americans in particular don't know a whole lot about. It's an epic initiative. It certainly has been called the biggest global infrastructure initiative ever in human history. I guess, given the scope of it on every continent and even in the Arctic, that's true. But I felt like there were a couple of different narratives that were being told about it. One from Beijing and one from, sort of critical countries that were from the governments of those countries or from the capitals of those countries who were, looking at it in a particular way. And I felt like, there's something in the middle. There's something about how the recipients are experiencing this, how they see not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but China's growing global influence in general and how it affects their lives. What are they seeing that's positive? What are they seeing that's negative? What are they seeing that's somewhere in the middle? And why are different countries, just sort of making different calculations about what's in their best interests? So I thought, again, the best way to, figure out what's actually going on is to get out and do some reporting. So I went to a dozen countries, partnered with local journalists for the very same reason that I always partnered with a young Chinese reporter or young Chinese assistant when I was in Beijing. Also, the younger journalists who I worked with were a great help because, they often would have a different perspective than people who had grown up with a different kind of perception of China. Maybe before China was as able to make investments and be as involved in the world. So that was kind of how I approached it. And, I've been an audio journalist for decades. And so being able to tell the story for the ear with a lot of, sort of rich sounds and scenes and and voices of people in the countries that are affected was my approach.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to our chat where we have a question from an audience member called Nathaniel Goldstein, who asks, how do you three as journalists interview or do research with the knowledge that individuals might withhold information to protect themselves? The chat has moved, so let's see. Or are not willing to speak with you out of fear from retribution by Chinese authorities. Alyssa, I'll turn to you with that because you're safely editing from Sydney, but you're dealing with reporters who sometimes may have threads in their stories that leave questions to be answered. So how do you push your reporters to explain better what is missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start by echoing Mary Kay's point from earlier, which is that, Chinese interviewees are not unique in not necessarily being 100% open, 100% honest. You can be talking to someone from a major US listed company who might not necessarily be giving you all of the facts or all of the information for any number of reasons. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. And also Chinese interviewees, like China's not a monolith and different people will behave differently. That said, obviously, dealing with interviews in China, a lot of people will not want to give their full names. People might, a lot of the quotes in stories that I edit, you'll have just someone using their English first name or just their Chinese surname. I guess the thing to say is that in the editing process, I am essentially interviewing my reporters about who these people are, how they know them, whether they were, the way we always describe it at Bloomberg is, was this person in the room? And if they weren't in the room, how close were they to the room? So, so not all of the information necessarily makes it to the story, but that doesn't mean that the reporter and the editor haven't had a detailed conversation about where that information has come from and how reliable it is. And then there's a question about what you publish and what you don't publish, which is the same as reporting from anywhere.
Sure. I would add, basically, to answer Nathaniel's question, triangulating. If someone says something, check it against one or two or three other sources. That's true no matter where you're reporting from. Another question from our chat comes from Christina Lee. What do you suggest for those working in media outside of China to move their career to China? Try to get transferred within a media company to a Chinese bureau? Apply to English language media companies in China? There are many routes. I'll tell you in brief, I got there by accident. I was working for a book publisher in New York, had an author under contract who was living in Beijing, who was late delivering his manuscript. I convinced the publisher to let me move to China to take over the magazine he was editing. It got confiscated by the police when I was on the train on the way there. And then I picked up a job stringing for a Hong Kong newspaper. So boil that down to be there in the right place at the right time when something is happening and be willing to work really hard. Mary Kay, do you want to tackle that differently?
Well, I'll just say that I remember meeting you when you were at the beginning of that journey on the stairs of the Kindly Commercial Building, where many journalists had their offices in the late 90s, before it was torn down and made the back gate of one of the diplomatic compounds. So I would say from the late 90s until like 2013, it was possible to go to China as a freelancer and, kind of work your way into some really interesting opportunities. That's indeed what I did when I moved to Thailand, when I first started out reporting in Asia. I had gotten some good advice when I was in journalism school from one of my professors who'd been a former editor of a Chicago paper, who said, look, you want to be a foreign correspondent anywhere. You could start in a small paper, work your way up to a medium paper, a large paper that's big enough to have bureaus, and then, kind of play the internal politics well enough that you get chosen to go where you want to go. Or you could just go. You could just pick a place where, it's interesting enough to editors that they want someone there, but not so interesting that they've already invested the money to have a full bureau there.
But that's not really possible in China anymore, is it?
That's what I'm saying. I mean, so it was a route that worked pretty well, I would say, in the 90s and first decade of the 2000s. And now, probably you have to either go the more traditional route of working your way up through a media organization, whether it's, NPR or the New York Times or, the problem is there aren't that many smaller media organizations that have bureaus in China. You could go in and work for the China Daily, which would be an interesting experience. Might not allow you to do the kind of journalism you want to do, but it certainly helps you understand what the media, the state-run media environment is like and how it works. And I know, serious journalists who did that when they went into China, or China Radio International or something like that.
I would say that as someone who's interested in covering China, you have to understand the way the state-run media works to understand how it is that China understands the world.
Yeah, and a side benefit of that could be that you get to know journalists who you might talk to later when you're working for other news organizations. You could also try being a freelancer, but that's kind of dicey at the moment in China because the government's being much more serious about checking up on what accreditation do you have. If you don't have an accreditation, why are you here? And they have, sort of tossed out a number of foreigners who were on visas that shouldn't have allowed them to do the work they were doing. There was a lot of that going around the time of the Olympics, before and after.
A good number of the reporters who were credited for major international newspapers are now doing their reporting on China from nearby, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from elsewhere. Yeah, what's the situation with Bloomberg and its visas now these days, Alyssa?
So Bloomberg has 3 bureaus in mainland China. We have Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. And we are still moving people between mainland China and other bureaus. So I would say to Christina's question that from my perspective, that is still a way of doing things. But it's certainly not, I would just echo Mary Kay again, like, yes, it's definitely not as simple as it was even a year or 2 years ago. And opportunities for foreign journalists in China across the board have been kind of reduced, and as you say, there are people reporting from Taipei or Seoul or Hong Kong for a lot of organizations. I wonder also, though, if you are really set on a media career in China, if moving to a Chinese bureau with an organization like Bloomberg isn't sort of working out, you might want to look into other kinds of work that you could do in China and take a break from the media part in order to get the China experience. That is another possibility, right? Your memoirs while you're doing it.
I wish our colleague Lloyd was with us. His route is really fascinating, I will say on his behalf, based on a chat we had the other day, that he went and studied Chinese at the university in Beijing, and then in addition to being the stunt double for internationally renowned boxer in a movie, he also then, we're talking about Mike Tyson. Lloyd's a big guy. He then has landed an enormous platform for himself, which is Africa-facing, covering sports, and is using that platform to connect with Chinese and Africans and, bridge some interesting divides through the discussion of basketball and soccer, 2 passions in China and on the continent of Africa. I encourage you to look him up on the internet and find him, because I'm sad to say that it looks like we're approaching the end of our session here, and it doesn't look like the technical glitch is going to allow him in today. You're welcome, Christina. I see that you thanked us for our insights. Do please reach out. You'll notice that I have put my email and website in the chat. Mary Kay and Alyssa, you're welcome to do the same if you want to continue this conversation with any of the other. Lloyd's comments in the chat says, I am devastated the powers that be didn't want me to chime in. Who knows, Lloyd? I suspect we will be hearing from you again. I really wanted to ask you about your panel discussion about racism in sports over the weekend. There's so much to be said about the way that things that might not seem political on the surface, like sport, can in fact, bridge the divide between cultures through the enjoyment of basketball and soccer. The NBA is as big as can be in China, absolutely enormous. I've done a little bit of work around that. Listen, as we approach, I wonder whether Mary Kay and Alyssa, you'd like to suggest a few recommendations of things you've read, heard, watched recently that would be good material for our audience to understand a little bit more about China. Alyssa, let's start with you. Any recommendations?
I'm just looking up the title of Denny McMahon's book about China's Great Wall of Debt, which I thought was a great read with some really excellent on-the-ground reporting, and some real craft there, but also just in terms of understanding the economic story in China right now, super illuminating.
That's Damien Ma, who is at the Paulson Institute, I believe.
It is. I'm going to put it in the chat, actually. Denny.
Okay, there we go.
Denny McMahon.
Denny McMahon, I'm sorry. Both Denny McMahon and Damien Ma at the Paulson Institute were contributors to ChinaFile. If anybody wants to who's who of people who are delving into China and its myriad topics, you can go to the ChinaFile.com/contributors page and see really an amazing list of folk whose work, from writing books to doing journalism, will pique your interest in ways that will help you make your decisions about whether you want to get into your China career further. And there's Richard McGregor, my former squash partner in Beijing. Another recommendation from Alyssa. I never beat him once, by the way. Mary Kay, what would you recommend?
Well, I'm gonna give a couple. I always enjoy the Sinica podcast. I've been on it a few times early on when it was in a ratty little apartment building in Beijing, and always enjoyed the conversation. The China History podcast, and as a former history and journalism major, I also want to recommend a book that I found really interesting and helpful when I was early in my career covering China. Two Kinds of Time by Grant Peck. Just a really good read to get some perspective about what makes China China. And I think that's another thing we didn't touch on as much, but doing your background reading about a place that you cover, and China in particular, and understanding that what's happening now has roots not just in the Communist Party's 100 years of existence, but in centuries of culture and political culture in China.
That's great. Those are both good recommendations. In the same vein, I will recommend a book by a press corps colleague of ours that changed my way of thinking about China, and that's John Pomfret's book, Chinese Lessons. If you haven't read that book, it's beautifully, clearly written. It's about his story, starting from a student in Nanjing and then following his roommates through their careers as China opened to the world. And it's a beautiful piece of long-term reporting that I highly recommend. So Yi-Wei, our Asia Society colleague, who is sort of our minder on this panel, how much time have we got left? Can you tell us in the chat? I think we've got 3 minutes more. Great, thanks so much. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yi-Wei, do you have any questions for us? It goes without saying that everyone should look at ChinaFile, as I said earlier. Thanks, Alyssa, for putting your contacts into the chat. Mary Kay, if you would be so kind to do the same, that would enable our audience to reach out to you. Do please listen to Mary Kay's podcast and it's really a great way to understand the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's take the last couple of minutes to tell us what we're working on next. Mary Kay?
Well, now I'm at Asia Society, so what I'm working on now at the Center on U.S.-China Relations. So we're doing a number of different things. We've got a new initiative that is looking at Taiwan and the strategic importance of its semiconductor industry, both for the U.S. and for China. We're looking at how the Chinese government's squeezing or cracking down on the private sector, and particularly the tech sector, like what kind of impact that will have in the long term on China's innovation capabilities and also on its economic growth. And we have a number of other projects in the works.
That's an interesting story about the semiconductor crunch because, of course, so much of the trade pipeline from chips from China has slowed down during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Alyssa, what about you? What is Bloomberg's focus in China at the moment? What's next?
Well, for me, at the moment, a lot of the work that I'm working on is around vaccines and vaccine diplomacy. The fact that as of this week, China is sort of the last country with a kind of COVID zero approach, now that even New Zealand is talking about living with the virus. Yeah, obviously we are very, very interested in the semiconductor story, and I would say supply chains and ESG investing are two sort of key themes for us at the moment, really key.
Wonderful. Thank you both. As we approach our last minute, I just want to say thanks to the audience. I'm sad to say we couldn't really see you, so we don't know whether you're applauding or scoffing, but we do hope you'll reach out and be in touch. I'm really sorry that Lloyd Randall was unable to join us. He's a wealth of information and is the only one of us who is inside China at the moment. So I do encourage you to reach out to him. Yue and the Asia Society, thank you so much for hosting this session of the China Careers Summit. Have a good afternoon, or a good morning in Sydney, and a good midday in San Francisco. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye. Thank you.